Sorry. Okay, so we've got 15 minutes to do creepy teachers. So we'll hit this one, kind of skim the surface, and I want to get to the like the last slide with the green sort of takeaways. And so if you've got summary questions that you want answered before we sign off at noon, start sending those via text message to Steve right now. So I'm going to hit this one real briefly, and then we'll answer text and do that. So you're the activities director. Ben comes to you and says the head track coach, Mrs. Smith, has been texting and Snapchatting him. Quick footnote, notice that we have a female teacher who is the sexual aggressor. That happens, I think that happens more this way right now than the other way. And administrators are still kind of surprised, like, whoa, this is a chick that's hitting on a high school boy. Yeah, that happens. At first, the communication was about track, but now it's starting to include Mrs. Smith's comments about Ben's appearance, and she's, thirsty and asking him if he finds her to be sexually attractive. What do you do? Obviously, you are going to take disciplinary action against Mrs. Smith. You're going to, I believe, put her on immediate administrative leave. You're going to investigate. In addition to the personnel issue, you've got a Title IX issue. The 2001 sexual harassment guidance, which is still good, made it clear that staff on student sexual relationships is sex harassment. In fact, the Davis case, which is the U.S. Supreme Court case on Title IX, was a teacher-student sexual relationship, interestingly, a lesbian relationship. So again, the idea that female teachers can't be sexually aggressive just isn't true. The guidance says that schools are responsible for taking prompt and effective action to stop the harassment and prevent its reoccurrence. That's easy, fire her. But look at the second sentence. You are also responsible for remedying the effects of the harassment on the student who is harassed. So again, you follow up with Ben. How you doing, buddy? You run him through the student assistance team if he's showing any kind of academic deficits or social deficits. Make sure that you don't forget that piece. I'm skipping this, although obviously you can't condition playing time or a grade on sexual favors. I know. Teacher on student sexual harassment, the question is, who can trigger liability for the district if you find out? I think in this scenario, the athletic director or activities director clearly is an official with the authority to institute corrective measures. If Ben had gone to another teacher or to a bus driver or a coach, I don't think they could necessarily impose liability on the district under the current rules. You have to have actual knowledge of harassment, and then if you're going to be liable, you have to have exhibited deliberate indifference. You don't care, you congratulate Mrs. Smith and give her a high five, or you turn the other way, or you just, it can't be true, Mrs. Smith would never do that. Those are all deliberate indifference responses. This is the kind of like my guiding principle in advising districts on these kind of sexually aggressive staff members. It's not the harassment itself that means that a family can sue you for Title IX violation. It's your response to the harassment that determines whether you're liable or not. So the fact that it happened is unfortunate, and we should stop it immediately, but that's not an automatic liability. The liability comes from how the AD responds when Ben comes to him. Now, one of the things that we talk about with staff members, and that I wanted to at least mention in a Title IX context, is the idea of adults grooming students. We think about grooming usually when it's pedophiles, like 50-year-old guy and 10-year-old kid gives the kid an iPod or iPhone and tells him not to tell the family. But one of the things that I want you to realize is increasingly we're seeing grooming taking place over social media with an adolescent or high school age student and the adult. I mean, it's not always like creepy guy with candy, right? The other thing about grooming is, and I see this over and over again, the predator also grooms the adults in the building or the community. When people say, oh my gosh, it couldn't be Mrs. Smith, she's just amazingly dedicated to kids, I want you to start asking yourself, is this someone who has like pulled the wool over your eyes and like very intentionally made it look like they're a better person than they really are to adults in the community, so that they would be held like to be above suspicion by the adults? That's one of the things as I have dug into the legal issues about adult predators. They don't just groom the victim, they also groom the parents of the victim and other adults in the context. So this is just the steps in the grooming process psychologically. I'll leave that to you just to have headlines. These are people from outside Nebraska, but we've had plenty of headlines in Nebraska.
Wait, talk about the principal failure to report in Omaha.
So in Omaha, there was a case of an elementary teacher who sexually assaulted students, and you've probably read some of the lurid stories in the Omaha World Herald. Was that yesterday or the day before? Just this week, the principal that was the building principal for that predator was arrested for failure to report suspected child abuse. Every single time we have a teacher-student relationship, even if you think it's consensual on the student's part, that is like the power imbalance makes it so it cannot be consensual. Always call the cops. If the police say there's nothing we're gonna do, if the police say we're gonna give Ben an award because Mrs. Smith is hot, I wanna kick that police officer in the groin, but we can't stop them from being good old boys, right? But we do report because that's the only way that we can protect your certificate and more importantly, protect you from criminal prosecution, which this principal from Omaha is now facing.
And in that case, if you remember, or if you read the story, it talks about the training that OPS did was really look at using the principal as an example to the rest of the staff, right? They changed their protocol and said essentially that the teachers had to report too.
Yeah.
And so if your school has not thought about in these cases, if the first report is from the teacher to the principal shall make the report, or the teachers can report themselves. If that's not clear to your staff,
yeah,
it shouldn't.
And teachers have an affirmative obligation to report as well. And the NSCA will tell teachers that they shouldn't just rely on the principal, they should also report. So I think everybody involved in these situations has a reporting obligation.
Yeah, in other words, it seems clear that I think some of those teachers probably failed to report too.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
and
long and short of it.
we'll see if they also get prosecuted. I won't be surprised if somebody doesn't.
Yeah.
Oh, so this is I think this cartoon is funny. Bobby thinks it's funny. Steve doesn't. That's because Steve is clearly not the funniest guy in the office. This is just a case that says, oh God, this is one where the superintendent, they're getting sued for Title IX violations. Somebody's sleeping with a student. Superintendent says, oh, I never had training. I don't know who's trained us on Title IX. Dude, that's your job. It's your job to make sure your staff gets trained.
Don't say it, even if it's true.
I know. Every time I read this case, I have to laugh.
We also had the board member on this one.
Oh God, yeah.
The Curtis, the defendant in the criminal case, comes to a board member and goes, yeah, I had inappropriate sexual relations with that student. And the board member tells absolutely nobody.
Because Curtis is a successful coach and the board member wants to win state. I mean, that's, so yeah, this is just a cautionary tale. If anybody ever asks you, have you had Title IX training? The answer is always yes, yes. And so here the court said failure to train the staff in recognizing the warning signs of the sexually aggressive teacher was a violation of Title IX. Then the failure to investigate exacerbated it, but it was the failure to train that was the source of the initial liability. So I wanted to buzz through to leave about 5 minutes for general questions. I'm hoping that we did that, and then we'll have about 2 or 3 minutes with this summary slide that I've got next.
And we have a good one here. Before you close today, can you review the options for the 3 roles and what you would recommend for a district with a superintendent and 1 principal?
So Steve showed me your text and said, this is a really good question. Will you answer it? The problem right now is I'm not 100% sure what to tell you. The regulations are only proposed, right? So it's possible that they will tweak the regs to allow for the single or dual administrator buildings. So we're kind of waiting and hoping and praying for that, although I don't hold out a lot of hope. And then I told the guys, I just said yesterday, we need to get into our conference room with us and a beer and the regulations and a bunch of copies of our policies and the Student Discipline Act. And we just need to run those scenarios internally ourselves to figure out what the answer is. Because if you're saying, I don't know what the answer is, then you're understanding the problem. Because we don't 100% know what we're going to advise either.
Here's what I would say, whether that's in the survey that we send out or just emailing us, if you as an administrator have thoughts practically about how you think it would be best that goes, we would love to consider those as we think through policy options. I mean, it is significant for us to know how administrators feel about this. So please, I don't know who asked the question or anybody else that's listening, send us thoughts, even if you're like, well, I don't know if this makes a lot of sense. Just send it and let us think about it because it's important for us to do that.
I mean, as you've seen the proposed regs, the decision maker can't be the Title IX coordinator, can't be the investigator, and the Student Discipline Act says the decision maker is the principal. So we got to find two people on the administrative chain of command that are below the principal, because the regs also don't say that it has to flow up the chain of command, but it's pretty clear that that's what they're assuming.
Well,
it's implicit. So I think an assistant principal maybe could flip-flop in terms of how you work the system. But I don't think we can say the superintendent investigates and the principal's is the decision maker, because under the Student Discipline Act, then the superintendent is your next level up if you go to hearing on the suspension or expulsion.
And Steve talked about the slide, and I thought about jumping up then, but because I don't like to interrupt people, I decided not to. But instead, you have to have impartiality, basically. So somebody raised the point earlier. Bobby, if I have 2 days from the day I decide that kid should be expelled to get the notice from the principal to the superintendent and then from the principal to the family, haven't I sort of biased myself in saying what I believe the truth is within 2 days of the misconduct? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. And so that's why we talked ourselves into, you might need 4, potentially 5 different staff members, depending on how strictly they read those impartiality requirements.
And the other thing that I worry about, and I was going to jump up but didn't want to interrupt Bobby because he's
That's
debating,
never stopped.
that I think it's possible, that slide where you had the Student Discipline Act on one side and the new regs on the other, it's possible to say, well, you can't take any action under the Student Discipline Act until the 25th day has run for the Title IX investigation. But that can't be right, because that means the sexual assaulter is in the classroom next to her or his victim for a month and a half. So I don't 100% know how we're going to do that.
Well, to add the last layer of it, and then we'll remind all of you that it was still in green. The Student Discipline Act allows you to discipline somebody who's been charged with sex assault, even off campus. So now you're going to add in the criminal component of that playing out, the deferring to law enforcement. What if we say he did, but the police says he didn't, or pleads it down, or vice versa? You're adding that in too, because our Student Discipline Act sort of begs the question of whether the school has to institute disciplinary consequences if a criminal charge actually happens.
So I think what we're probably going to land on internally is to emergency exclude the alleged sexually aggressive student while you run the Title IX investigation. And there's a specific portion of the notice of proposed rulemaking that I think would allow us to emergency exclude. That feels actually harsh to me, because now basically you're emergency excluding somebody for almost a month while you decide whether they did the bad thing or not. But I think that's where we're probably going to land in terms of discipline. But that doesn't answer the ultimate question, which is, we got a superintendent, a principal. Where's our 2 other people? We don't know. It may be a guidance counselor. Maybe you can crisscross districts. Maybe you're going to have to hire somebody from the outside. We're still trying to figure out. We'd like to give you a list of possible solutions. We haven't figured them out yet.
If Johnny has detention and comes to practice 30 minutes late, can he dress alone unsupervised?
Probably. Would you let Johnny in the Honor Society storeroom where all the candy for the vending machine is stored? Would you trust Johnny not to steal? So here's my question. Ask yourself this: would we risk property loss or property damage under the same circumstances? I think that kind of sets us up on a negligence standard. So possibly, although if Johnny jumps off a bench and gives himself a concussion, we'll have to be able to defend leaving him alone, but at least he's not going to have a victim.
And I think it's just a general responsibility analysis. Who's Johnny? I mean, is Johnny a good kid? Is Johnny not a good kid?
Well, and this goes back a little bit to how you need to start thinking about this issue differently. Have the detention teacher, whether male or female, stand outside the locker room and say, Johnny, you got a minute.
Go.
Right? That there are solutions, I think, practically that OCR would beg you to put in place.
Can the investigator be outside the district, for example, an ESU person?
I believe so. That is a solution that we believe is going to be an option. We've been through the regs a bunch, but they've only been out since November, so we got to wait to be sure, but I think so. Yes.
One of the potential issues, I'm assuming that's from an ESU person or somebody thinking about, hey, can't our ESU just hire these people and shop them out? It's a good question,
Always
Ted.
think Ted.
The ESU's potential liability in that is a really interesting thing to think through, because you have, I think, functionally undertaken some of those Title IX responsibilities. I think it's possible.
And you also are a federal fund recipient, so.
There's some stuff we have to think through in terms of what that means for liability for the ESU if that person doesn't do it.
But we think so.
Can we assume you'll have a new policy this summer, assuming the regs are finalized. Yeah, absolutely. will.
I think if the regs are not finalized, we are very intentionally not going to touch the Title IX or the universal complaint procedure and discrimination stuff, because we're going to wait until the regs are finalized. But if they're finalized when our updates go out, we'll include it. And if they aren't, we'll have to send a freestanding update like we do sometimes.
And Brad Jacobson has pointed out, we've got Vargas's bill, LB 515. One, it has some hearing officer provisions in there that changes things on the student discipline side. But there's also a change in the timelines.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so those are going to interfere with the Title IX requirements as well. So we're going to have to measure those out and balance
And
this
that
out.
was so many questions on the comments were about student discipline that I'm assuming they're going to have to address that.
But I don't know. I have asked through the very limited connections I have that somebody put Vargas's bills, hopefully him, side by side with the Title IX regs, and at least maybe we can start the conversation. I don't know what's going to happen, but it'll be interesting to see if that bill goes, what it could mean moving forward.
Under the new regs, isn't the Title IX coordinator only the organizer of the investigation?
Starts to look more like that.
Yeah. And then the
They
question
provide
is,
some of the services
what
or set up
role,
the services.
what role can they play then as the investigation unfolds? And it looks to me like it's pretty limited.
I think that the primary function of that Title IX investigator as you get going is figuring out those interim measures that are necessary. So that's why I think a counselor could make some sense when that person has to decide, is there something as the investigation goes on that we need to put in place? But you run into weird
But under the-
certification issues.
Under the K-12 provision of the rules, it also says that the Title IX coordinator may be required in many instances to be the complainant, to file a complaint.
I don't know who asked this one, but I like it. Will KSB pay for my blood pressure pills?
We have excellent health insurance, no problem. So is anything else?
That's it.
Okay.
It's high noon, so if you got to split, you can watch the recording,
I
but
was
you
gonna
should
say,
cover this.
I just want to hit this. This is just a summary of what we have seen, what we're thinking are the big changes coming under the proposed regulations. The return to the deliberate indifference standard is a positive change for schools. We could have done a whole 45-minute bird walk on what OCR was doing with their weird standard. Good news, one standard for OCR and the courts. That is a positive for schools. The whole thing about letting the person who has allegedly been victimized and the person accused of the sexual aggression, letting them ask each other questions. We're gonna let a kindergartner cross-examine a third grader. That's going to be super weird. The regulations say in a K-12 context, the questions don't have to be made in person. It doesn't have to be face-to-face confrontation, but you do have to allow them to ask questions in writing if you don't allow face-to-face confrontation. So you can imagine crazy helicopter mom writing, isn't it true that in second grade you fondled yourself? I mean, it's going to be nuts. And we're going to have to think about exactly how we do it to get that right. And honestly, I don't know the answer yet. We do have more flexibility in how we respond to what the victim needs, but way less responsibility or flexibility in what the investigation itself looks like. And this question that we've had pop up over and over and over again this morning, how does this structure change if we can't have the decision maker and the Title IX coordinator do the investigation? It's going to completely change the structure and training that we're going to have to roll out. And we're working on it, but until the regs are finalized, I don't, even when the regs are finalized, it's gonna take us some time to get our minds around it. But I do want you to have that seed planted that potentially big changes. I don't see there's any, changes are coming. What exactly they are, we don't 100% know yet, but we can see what's in the horizon. What are you laughing at? That's it? Okay.
Shane asked there at the comment.
12:03, we will have the recording up hopefully yet today. I'll just go and cut it into iMovie yet this afternoon. If you have other questions, you can text them to Steve as the day goes on. We will see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye all y'all.